Nearly there. Very well.
Good morning. It is still morning. It's such a pleasure to be here to conclude our colloquium. It's a very honorable position to be in. I'm very grateful for it, as I'm grateful for a wonderful conference experience once more. The standard is high. And I'm delighted also to be back in Birmingham, because when I worked here a few years ago, or many years ago, in the Compol project, one of my duties was to transcribe Latin manuscripts, and our base text was on the Vulgate. And while I did that, I noticed that there ever so often are differences in the verse division between the Latin edition and the Greek edition. And I looked into this closer, and I noticed it's not only a problem between different languages, it's also between Greek editions that we have a difference. So I was rather pleased when I found in the old pre-Nestle-Aland version, so before the 26th, that there's actually a note where the verse division comes from, and this is what it says. The verse division has been determined from Thiselton, which only 5 times varies from the earliest one, introduced by Stephanus, that's Estienne in 5051, the moment the modern verse division started, and from Thiselton himself sometimes departs erroneously from it in his text. Now, I double-checked, it's still true, but the note is not kept in any later editions. But when I saw the 1 Corinthians is there, I got very excited working on 1 Corinthians, and I had a look, and I discovered that it is a mess. It's a mess, but a pleasant mess. And I thought, well, you know, Easter is coming, it's spring, so maybe it's time for some spring cleaning. Thank you for joining me. Here are our chores. So first we have to look in some New Testament editions. Then my major part of this presentation will be looking into biblical manuscripts, Greek, Latin bilinguals, and then very briefly highlights from the patristic citations, and then some conclusions, and the 5th point is lunch. Before we start, let me take a moment to count my blessings and thank my funding bodies for supporting my research on 1 Corinthians and the New Testament bilinguals. That's the FWO, the Research Foundation Flanders, and the ERC, the European Research Council. And although my research is funded by the European Union, this does not mean that the European Union agrees with everything I'm going to say. So, yeah. It's a serious disclaimer. So, New Testament editions, this is what we see in Nestle-Aland, and you see in red where the verse division is, and the New Revised Standard Version updated edition is based on that text. So, let's read it. But the married man is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please his wife, next verse, and his interests are divided, full stop. Yeah. And the unmarried woman and the virgin are anxious about the affairs of the Lord, so that they may be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please her husband. So let's have a look. This is indeed from Thiselton, so that's right. The previous note is still true in Nestle-Aland 28. We can see kai memérisται, full stop. Here we go. Is indeed from Thiselton. That's where it comes from. But if you look at this 16th century edition, and if you have looked at it at the moment when the verse division started, it's not only the Greek text in the middle, but we have 2 Latin versions on each side. So on one side is the Erasmus, one of the Erasmus translations into Latin. On the other side is the Vulgate text at the time, but the verse division is the same as we have it in the Stuttgart Vulgate and also in the Oxford Vulgate later on. So instead of going into all the details, I just marked the one word that tells you immediately where we are in the verse. That's memérisται, that's the diuisus est here. And you can see in the 16th century, it's part of verse 33. In the Nestle-Aland edition, it's part of 34. Of course, there's a different Greek text, but we will come to that in a moment. So for now, let's take a note of that, and let's not look into editions. Let's actually look into manuscripts and see what's going on there. Lucky us, in verse 34, there is a test passage in there from the Text on Text volumes, and it's marked here in red. So he ďagamos kai he parthenos. So that part is test passage 19. It has 9 different readings that are tested, and then we have some lacuna omissions and the usual noise. Out of these 9, 6 are tested only once or twice, and for the sake of time, I will just not focus on those, but instead we'll focus on the other 3, and those can be sorted And I'm following here a bit the logic of Thiselton in his commentary on First Corinthians, but I also got a sneak preview into Hugh Halton's commentary, for which I'm very grateful, and I loved it. So let's see what our cleaning crews are, but I like the team analogy more than Ian has also used to, a bit sporty, there are these baseball caps around. So let's look at this like they are in teams. And that is, of course, slightly simplifying it, but it's Friday, we had a long conference, and some have been late. So the first team is team P46, but also Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus in that, and I call it P46 and the team OD. So what we can see here, I've added the Guinea because it really doesn't make sense without the woman to understand the test passage. So it's the unmarried woman, and I call this the blue Chi for today, and the unmarried virgin. Metzger calls this a conflation with the other forms that we will see. Second team, team P15, Papyrus 15 is also old, of course, so it's also an oldie. And it's also attested in Codex Vaticanus and other older sources, but it's later then adapted in Nestle-Aland. I know it's anachronistic, but I call it team Nestle-Aland today. So what is not there, just the last thing, ӓγαμος. And then the third one, also slightly anachronistic, but it's the majority of the manuscripts, team majority text, doesn't have the blue Chi, but now distinguishes between a woman, who then you can understand as wife, so not the unmarried one, and the virgin. And then most of the times, the ӓγαμος becomes the subject of the next part in the sentence. So you can't see this when you just look at the test passage, but that's what's going on here. Thiselton, who I've already mentioned, he puts the finger on the problem, and the main issue, he says, in better English than I can do, the main issue of substance is whether the verb memérisται should be construed as referring to the subject of the previous verse, which is then the man is divided in his interests, or whether it points forward to what follows to yield some such meaning as there is a difference between the married woman and the unmarried. So huge difference. And as I said, this test passage is a bit too short to understand the broader picture. So when you look in the Nestle-Aland 28, you see, oh, near me, there's another variation unit before that. And I think we need to look at this. So if you look at Chi Mεμέρισται Chi, this is a very condensed apparatus here. And for those who like philosophy, all four logical options are preserved in manuscript. So the fullest one is Chi Mεμέρισται Chi, which is in P15 and P46. So suddenly they're one team here, but not for the later part. We have the one where we have Chi first, but not at the end. We also have the opposite, where there's no Chi at the beginning, but at the end. And we have the simplified version, where there's only the word. So this is a condensed, but what does it mean together with the test passage? So I thought, let's combine them and see whether we can get a pattern. And what I did is, I didn't do the whole text, I didn't look into all Greek manuscripts, please forgive me. I looked into, like others did here at the conference, into those that we have transcribed as part of the project, thanks to all the transcribers and proofreaders involved, 142. And to these, I added also, for when I talk about the Latin ones, I added the bilinguals that were not transcribed to make sure that those are also in the picture. You can look at them also in a synopsis following epistolae.org. And what is the result? So team oldest, team P46, always has Chi Mεμέρισται Chi, so the full version long reading. Team Nestle-Aland has also Chi Mεμέρισται Chi, but also Chi Mεμέρισται without the second Chi, but always, first two teams have the first Chi, always. And this is the blue Chi team, so to say, also having the first Chi. Team majority text, not surprising if there are also the later manuscripts, we have all four versions, but you can see the majority of the majority has no Chi at the beginning, but at the end, and we also have the one where no Chi is present, and that's basically also the pattern here. Whenever you have a Chi before the mεμέρισται, you are either in team 46 or in team Nestle-Aland. If you have no Chi before the mεμέρισται, you are automatically in the team majority text. And the big difference again is in between the three teams. So basically two blue Chi or yellow Chi. Now let's look into the Latin part. And may not be popular to say, but Latin is so much cooler than Greek. And definitely, definitely when it comes, I'll stand firm. Definitely when it comes to mεμέρισται as a perfect passive, because in the Latin you have to use a participle, and the participle has a gender that you can identify immediately. So logically we have three options. divisus est, that's male. The man is divided, goes immediately with the verse 33. Diuisa est, the woman is divided, goes with verse 34 and what follows. Divisum est, made neuter, not attested in this context, but logically, of course, possible as translation. Yeah, well, yeah, no, not attested here. So what did I do? I looked into all the Latin transcriptions that we made for Confl, but also in addition, of course, 135, as we heard yesterday, is also important to look at, and also the later bilinguals that are not Old Latin, but just to get the complete picture. So let's see how the Latin evidence supports our team. Sorry, all this, you look old, not supported in the Latin. Team Nestle-Aland is supported by what we can see monolingual Latin manuscripts and later the Vulgate. And we have the male form, et divisus est et, vice kai, et, and male form. The majority text is also in various forms attested, but as you can see, always diuisa, diuisa, diuisa. So always female. I think we're making progress with cleaning here. So we have the male always in when we have the team Nestle-Aland, and we have the feminine in team majority text. So it makes a rather clear picture, slightly destroyed when we look into the bilinguals. So let's start here with the ones that I've added in the box. Those are the old ones, and we have heard much about it, and we won't go into debates on whether they are copied or not from each other, but usually that's taken that Sangamonensis is a copy of Claromontanus and Augiensis is somehow connected to Boernerianus. And I tried to color code it because of the different sigla that we have. So it's only Claromontanus and Boernerianus where Greek and Latin behaves the same. And in the others, they behave slightly differently, but it doesn't really matter because they are all in the team majority text. So that's the pattern. The later ones, however, which you can see in bold and underline, they behave differently, which is not surprising because in their Greek text, they are the majority text, and in the Latin part, they are the Vulgate text. So that's why they are separated here. And there would be more to say, but we have a lunch to go to. So let me summarize this. Yeah, well, it's a bit generalized, but we can say that Team Nestle-Aland is supported by the monolingual sources and the Vulgate, and the majority text is supported by the bilingual sources, or better to say text type D, because we do have some monolingual sources here, but we have heard about them already. 89, the anonymous Budapest commentary, and 135 about Anna Persic talked yesterday. So as being close to the text type. Now here the Book of Amar, that's the outliner, but we don't have time for weirdos. So let's continue. And that was my largest part of the presentation, the biblical manuscripts. Let's have a very brief look into patristic citations. It's not doing them justice, but I will give you a highlight from each, so from the Greek and the Latin, and to see whether we can find out. Well, first of all, also the patristic citations are divided in both in the Greek and the Latin. And here's an example from the Greek. My highlight is John Chrysostom, because John Chrysostom quotes bits and parts of what is our verse 34. And that is very useful because quoting a bit tells us how he combines the elements. And here's the first example. In Homily 19 and also in other places, he just takes what is here in red, memérisται kai hegunen kai parthenos, the woman and the virgin are divided. So clearly it goes with the feminine reading. And he also has the next part of the verse combined in Homily 78 on 1 Timothy, where he has ӓγαμος μεριμνά τάτου Κυρίου. So the unmarried woman is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, which also tells you this must be the majority text reading and supporting the feminine reading. So John Chrysostom is the majority text. And in the Latin, it's even harder to choose a highlight because we would have Ambrosiaster with 2 recensions, as Vogels tells us. And in recension alpha, we have the male reading, divisus est, and in recension gamma, we have the female reading, diuisa est. So that's already divided. But Jerome is even cooler because he mentions this passage and discusses the difference. And that I would like to show you. In Contra Iovinianum, he says, now I briefly remind you of this, that in the Latin manuscripts, this passage is read as follows. Divided is the woman and the virgin, diuisa est, so female reading. Although this has its own meaning and has been interpreted in that way by me too, according to the context of the passage, it does not testify to apostolic truth. For the apostle certainly wrote, as we have translated above, he is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please his wife, and he is divided. So Jerome has this opinion that clearly the male reading should be the older. So that makes him team Nestle-Aland, and that's also team Vulgate, but don't be deluded. Of course, Jerome is not the one responsible for the Vulgate revision in the Pauline epistles, but it turns out that this, in the end, is where we end up with. So coming to my conclusion, so we have tried to clean this up a bit by looking at the New Testament editions, by looking into biblical manuscripts, Greek, Latin, bilinguals, and just a few highlights from the patristic citations. Now, who is divided is the title of my presentation. I think all of them, the editions, the manuscripts, the patristic evidence, all are divided, but I think we can say a few things more. First of all, when you look into the UBS edition and you look at this letter labeling that also Tommy has mentioned yesterday in his presentation, this is marked as D like Dora. So it's the category that but the committee had great difficulty in arriving at the decision, and it's a category that is used only rarely. But I think if we take a long enough variation unit, that may help us to sort this out a bit better. And that's also what is happening in the next few years, as far as I've seen through the commentary. My second point and conclusion is versions are really helpful. And in this case in particular, because the male and the female become so clear through looking at the version. And I think once this is clear, we understand also the Greek evidence much better and how we can allocate the manuscripts. My third point is that coming back to these editions and the way I started, it's interesting that from the very first moment onwards that we have modern verse division, this is a divided verse. There is no original verse 34, so to say, because it has always also here been divided, because the text is not the same in the Latin and in the Greek. Because here we have the majority text and here we have the Vulgate text. So even there, verse 34 is not absolutely identical, even if the memérisται is in verse 34. So no original verse 34. Maybe we need a divided verse in the ECM at some point. But there's also another interesting pattern, because now I have put the Byzantine text from Pierpont text here as the majority Byzantine reading, and we can see that in the old days, 16th century, the memérisται is always put in verse 33, but in the modern editions, it's always in 34, and this is regardless of whether it's the male or the female reading. So there has been a shift in just where to put this. And that, of course, also affects the punctuation, which is also, of course, an editorial decision. And this, I think, is my last point that I really want to make. So there is, of course, different punctuation. But divisions, verse divisions, and punctuations are editorial decisions. They do not change the text at all. They just give us the interpretation or may influence how we read the text. I have a colleague who is a systematic theologian, our best friends, I think, and he says that biblical scholars are a bunch of people who are obsessed with verse numbers and verse counting and pointless punctuation. And I hope I have not proven him right today. Thank you very much.
Still have time for questions.
To add that, did you consider papyrus 120?
No.
Because it's one of those stolen, manuscripts and so on, and it contains all in this. So it goes into the equation on the first segment, where it goes with the majority text.
Yes.
And it's earlier witness than ever.
Yeah, I mean, the labeling was, it was anachronistic anyway. Yeah, but I think, it makes actually the point, because I think very early on, we have all these options. So there's not really a development. So, yeah, even when Metzger says it's a conflation, it's an interesting one to consider further. Well, thanks for the comment.
Go ahead.
Oh, so which do you think is the correct? How do you think it should be punctuated?
Oh no, I'm not making that. I have an opinion on when you decide that it's a male reading and you have the punctuation after memérisται. So the diuisus says why people in Münster. Did you put it in verse 34? I think that should be logical to put it in verse, but it's just, it doesn't really matter. It's a modern kind of thing, but I think it could confuse students. Yeah, that's what I think, because perhaps in the mind, verse is end of sentence. That's why. But on the punctuation, you know, we're working on this ECM. We have to look at this thing more deeply, and then we'll make a decision. But I think a divided verse. Can we have a divided verse? Yeah.
Splits guiding line for the verse.
Split, yeah, split guiding. Yeah.
Martin has a question. Martin.
To give an answer on the question what is done in Greek, yeah, I looked into the oldest papyrus, or one of the two oldest papyrus, that is papyrus 15, and it has a spatial after the marriage time. So I would say it signals a full stop after the marriage time. So
No,
the
because
papyrus.
yeah, you can look into all the spacing and punctuation, but you have a lot of mess there as well. So you can't trust this, because there are even manuscripts, even if it goes on, that make weird punctuation that does not go with what actually the grammar is that they have. So it's not as helpful as one may think. But yes, you have some manuscripts where their spacing or punctuation is in line how we would expect it from a modern perspective, that is after wherever they think the sentence ends. But we also have the opposite. So it's not such a clear picture. And when I started to come to, into working with manuscripts, one wise advice that was given to me was never fall in love with one manuscript. So no, I'm not give priority to one just because it follows what I would like. Yes.
But there's an editor of also a digital edition, and if you want to put everything in parallel, you have to take a decision.
Yeah, I'm going with the validate no
Okay.
And you know, after being in that for a while, I think, oh, I see why you did that. You know, it makes your life easier. It's also a bit, yeah, later, but yeah.
We have this discussion permanently, but
Yeah.
how the verification must be.
Yeah,
But we have to take a decision, yeah?
yeah, but then we also have to trust that the people who use our edition do understand it.
Yeah.
So I think our introductions need to be good, and hopefully they read them.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
it's
the problem.
yeah, it's a problem. Yeah.
We don't
But then you read the introduction and nothing is said about the first edition in Nestle-Aland. Yes.
Well, thank you. That was a great end to the conference.